August 1983, Queens, New York. An FBI agent sat in a surveillance van listening to a conversation happening inside a house. The agent heard something that would eventually cost the man his life. Angelo Ruggiero, a mobster connected to John Gotti, was discussing heroin deals on his kitchen phone. He didn't know the FBI was listening. More importantly, he didn't know that his boss, Paul Castellano, would soon find out. And when Castellano learned about the drug dealing, he promised death. That promise would spark a chain of events that would destroy the Gambino family's leadership and change organized crime in New York forever. The rule: one cardinal edict. Paul Castellano became the boss of the Gambino family in 1976. He inherited a rule from his predecessor, Carlo Gambino. The rule was simple and absolute. Nobody deals drugs. Not one member of the Gambino family could get involved in narcotics trafficking, not under any circumstances. If you were caught dealing drugs, you didn't become a made man, you got killed. Castellano enforced this rule strictly. He had people murdered for breaking it. A man named Angelo Melli was a Gambino member who dealt drugs in Brooklyn. When he got arrested and went to prison, Castellano ordered his death the moment Melli got released. That was the message. Break the drug rule and you die. The question everyone asked was, why? Why was Castellano so rigid about this one thing? The answer was simple. Federal prosecutions for drugs carried massive prison sentences. 20 years, 30 years, life sometimes. If a guy got arrested for drugs, Castellano believed he might flip on his boss to reduce his sentence. So it was safer to just prohibit drugs completely. But there was a problem with this rule. By the 1980s, drugs were the most profitable business in organized crime. Heroin generated more money than gambling, more than loan sharking, more than stealing, more than any traditional mob enterprise. Young mobsters saw that money and got frustrated. Why should they make thousands running street rackets when they could make hundreds of thousands dealing drugs? And the more frustrated they got, the more they started doing it anyway, secretly, behind their boss's back. The tension: 2 generations, 1 family. John Gotti was a mid-level capo in the Gambino family in 1983. He was 43 years old, a street guy, the type of mobster who made his money through violence and intimidation, not business deals. His mentor was the underboss, Aniello Della Croce. He was the old guard, the man who reported directly to Castellano, but also represented the street soldiers who wanted action and money. Della Croce understood something Castellano didn't. The younger generation of mobsters wanted to make serious money. So Della Croce quietly allowed drug dealing within his faction, the Street Crow, Gotti's Crow. It wasn't official, it wasn't approved, but it was tolerated. Castellano had built a wall between himself and the street. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island, far from the neighborhoods where his soldiers operated. He gave orders, but didn't understand street-level realities. Gotti, by contrast, was in the streets every day. He understood what young mobsters wanted. He also understood what he could make if he controlled the drug trade. By 1983, Gotti and his crew were making serious money dealing heroin. But they were doing it quietly, carefully, never in front of Castellano, until Angelo Ruggiero got sloppy. The mistake, the phone call. Angelo Ruggiero was Gotti's close friend. Ruggiero had a brother named Salvatore, who died in a plane crash. After Salvatore's death, Ruggiero and his brother, Gene Gotti, decided to deal drugs to settle Salvatore's estate and take care of loose ends. They involved themselves in serious heroin trafficking, but Ruggiero wasn't careful about it. In 1983, the FBI got a warrant to bug Ruggiero's house. They planted a listening device in his kitchen. Ruggiero started talking about drugs on a phone he thought was secure. He talked to his wife, he talked to his associates, he discussed amounts, prices, delivery schedules. All of it went directly into the FBI's recording devices. The conversations were clear, detailed, incriminating. In August 1983, the FBI arrested Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti for dealing heroin, based entirely on the wiretap recordings. Castellano heard about the arrests immediately, and he was furious.
Castellano called Ruggiero. He wanted the wiretap transcripts. Ruggiero refused to give them to him. It was a power play. Ruggiero was saying, "I answer to Della Croce, not to you." Castellano interpreted this refusal as insubordination. But more importantly, Castellano saw what was in the transcripts. Evidence that Gotti's entire crew was involved in massive drug dealing. The question in Castellano's mind was simple. Was Gotti operating this independently, or was he part of the conspiracy? According to multiple sources, Castellano started planning to have both Ruggiero and Gotti killed. He felt threatened by them. They had violated his cardinal rule. They had challenged his authority by refusing to give him the transcripts. And Castellano hinted that he planned to break up Gotti's crew entirely. The fear when Della Croce dies. In December 1985, Agnello Della Croce died of cancer. Della Croce had been the buffer between Castellano and Gotti's crew. Della Croce protected them. Della Croce covered for them. Della Croce made sure Castellano didn't find out how much drug dealing was happening. With Della Croce gone, that protection disappeared. Castellano immediately appointed Thomas Bellotti as the new underboss. Bellotti was a Castellano loyalist, a yes man, not a protector of the street crews. Gotti understood what this meant. He was now exposed. Without Della Croce, Castellano could move against him. And according to informants, Castellano was planning to do exactly that. The boss was going to either demote Gotti or have him killed. Gotti had to make a decision: wait around and hope Castellano changed his mind, or move first. The decision, the point of no return. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti were having dinner at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. A hit team was waiting outside, 4 men in long coats and Russian fur hats. John Gotti sat in a car across the street with Sammy Gravano, using a walkie-talkie to communicate with the hit team. As Castellano and Bellotti stepped out of their limousine, the hit team opened fire. Castellano took 2 bullets, then another, then another. He fell to the pavement, dead. Bellotti was also killed. In less than 30 seconds, the leadership of the Gambino family had been decapitated, and it was all because Castellano had banned drug dealing. If Castellano had allowed controlled drug operations, Gotti and his crew would never have had a conflict with him. If Castellano had been more connected to the street, he might have seen the uprising coming. If Castellano had been less isolated, living on Staten Island in his mansion, maybe he could have negotiated with the younger generation. But he didn't, and he died for it. The aftermath, the power shift. Within 2 weeks of Castellano's death, John Gotti was elected as the new boss of the Gambino family. The street crew had taken over. The business-focused faction, represented by Castellano, was gone. And one of the first things Gotti did as the new boss was reverse Castellano's drug ban. Gotti allowed his crew to deal drugs openly. Within months, the Gambino family was making more money than ever before. Gotti himself was making an estimated $10 million to $12 million per year. His crew was making millions in heroin and cocaine trafficking. The very thing Castellano had forbidden became the foundation of Gotti's power. The irony, what Castellano was right about. Here's what's interesting about this story. Castellano's fear about drug dealing leading to government prosecution was actually justified. In 1990, the FBI arrested Gotti and Sammy Gravano based partially on evidence related to narcotics operations. Gravano, Gotti's underboss, eventually became an informant partly because of disputes over drug dealing. The apartment bug that ultimately convicted Gotti discussed drug operations and murders committed to protect those operations. So Castellano's original instinct was correct. Drug dealing leads to federal prosecution and cooperation deals. But Gotti didn't care. He gambled that he could run a drug empire, stay in power, and avoid prosecution. He was wrong. But for nearly a decade, he was right. He ruled New York. He made more money than any mob boss in history. He just eventually got caught. The cost. What Gotti's drug empire really cost. When Gotti legalized drug dealing in the Gambino family, he created wealth. But he also created something else. Addicted communities. Harlem, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens. These neighborhoods were flooded with heroin and cocaine under Gotti's watch. Addiction rates skyrocketed. Overdose deaths increased. Families were destroyed. The wealth that Gotti made came directly from the suffering of poor communities in New York. This is the part of the mob story that never gets romanticized. The money came from somewhere, and that somewhere was neighborhoods where people were losing their children to addiction. The bigger picture, the clash of two eras. Paul Castellano represented an older generation of mob bosses. They understood that sustainable organized crime required discipline, rules, organization. You didn't break the rules. You didn't show off. You didn't draw attention. John Gotti represented a new generation. He cared about rules less and money more. He showed off, he courted media attention, and he flaunted his wealth. The conflict between Castellano and Gotti was really a conflict between two different philosophies about how organized crime should work. Castellano thought it should be a business, quiet, professional, long-term focused. John Gotti thought it should be about power, visible, domineering, personal. In the short term, Gotti won. He took over, he made more money, he became famous. But in the long term, Castellano was right. His flashiness and his decision to allow large-scale drug trafficking made him easier to investigate and prosecute. By 1992, Gotti was in prison for life. By contrast, Castellano, if he hadn't been murdered, might have lived to old age in his mansion, never spending a day in federal prison. The question: was Castellano right to ban drugs? From a business perspective, probably yes. Drug trafficking generated enormous heat from law enforcement. Federal agents focused on narcotics investigations. The penalties were severe. Long-term, a crime family based on extortion, labor racketeering, and gambling operations would probably have been more sustainable than one based on drug distribution. But from a human perspective, the drug ban was just a way of deciding which crimes were acceptable and which weren't. The Gambino family committed murders. They committed extortion. They committed loan sharking. They committed labor trafficking. The question wasn't whether they committed crimes. The question was which crimes they committed. Castellano chose to draw the line at drugs. Gotti chose to allow drugs as long as they were profitable. Neither choice was moral. One was just about profit margins and prison sentences. The legacy, why this matters. The conflict between Castellano and Gotti had consequences that rippled through New York organized crime for decades. After Gotti took over, the Gambino family became more violent and more involved in narcotics trafficking. This attracted more federal attention. More prosecutions followed. By the time Gotti died in prison in 2002, the Gambino family had been devastated by federal convictions. Castellano's philosophy of keeping the family disciplined and conservative might have allowed the family to survive and operate for longer. But we'll never know, because Gotti moved first, and Castellano died in front of a restaurant.
The final lesson: pride before the fall. Paul Castellano's downfall came from his isolation. He lived on Staten Island. He didn't associate with street soldiers. He didn't understand their frustrations. He issued an absolute rule about drug dealing without understanding that this rule was unsustainable given market conditions. He thought his authority was sufficient to enforce the rule through fear. But fear only works if people believe you'll follow through. And Gotti didn't believe Castellano would actually kill him. Gotti believed he could manipulate Della Croce and Castellano's other advisors into protecting him. When Castellano proved willing to move against Gotti anyway, it was too late. Castellano's pride in his authority, his isolation from the streets, and his underestimation of Gotti's willingness to commit murder all combined to create his downfall. He was a powerful man, but power without wisdom is just a target.